Welcome to Interview from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlsen, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on teleSUR. We don't hear very much in Mexico about the literary genre of science fiction, perhaps because too often the reality is weirder than the fiction. And yet it's a growing genre. Today on Interview from Mexico, we're going to talk to Bernardo Fernandez, Beth, a master science fiction writer and also a writer of police novels and graphic novels. Join us.
Hace varios años escribí una historia sobre un sicario arrepentido y que ganó un premio en México y otro premio en España. Es la novela esta que se llama Tiempo de Alacranes.
To talk about his work in science fiction, detective novels, and graphic novels, we're here with Bernardo Fernandez, Beth. Beth, thanks so much for being with us here on Interviews from Mexico.
Muchas gracias, Laura. Encantado de estar aquí.
I wanted to start out by asking you, a large part of your work is in science fiction. The novels Blue Gel and Snake Eyes, collections of stories, anthologies of North American and Mexican authors. Has it been difficult to promote science fiction here in Mexico? You don't hear about it much.
Yes, it's been really complicated the last 25 years because there's no, or there hadn't been, there's no very deep tradition of not just science fiction, but rather fantasy literature, what now my friend Alberto Chimal has called literature of the imagination. And we come from a tradition where the foundational work, right, Don Quixote de la Mancha, is a mockery of the Night Tales, which were the science fiction of the golden century. So, well, furthermore, they never allowed imagination. There's a really beautiful passage where Quixote is riding a flying horse, and he goes to the moon on a horse named Clavaleño. But he comes back and finds it's all a dream. So it's not... In English, in Shakespeare, ghosts and fairies appear, and in French, in Rabelais's Gargantua and Pantagruel, there are giants who drink wine out of wooden barrels. That is, the foundation works alongside us, don't have a problem with the imagination, but in Spanish they do. It's something that we've inherited. So always the authors who devote themselves to this, from the golden century to practically modern times, are considered oddities in the entire region. In all of Latin America, in Spanish-speaking America, from Spain to Tierra del Fuego, the authors dedicated to this kind of thing, even though there have been some very good ones, were usually considered something weird. There's always the example of Juan Rulfo, which is a ghost story, Pedro Páramo. There's Borges and Cortázar as the two giants of literature, not just Argentine literature, but also fantasy literature. However, it's a theme that is still seen with mistrust in the local context. Now, the best response that I have to this is that it's because we're countries that don't produce technology. But as my friend Mauricio José Schwartz says, but we suffer from it. So we build based on this, from the other side where the Anglo-Saxon tradition of science fiction has developed.
So if the literature of fantasy is this permission to imagine other worlds and other futures, why do you think it's so inhibited in our society today?
Well, because after the revolution, specifically in Mexico, after the revolution, there was almost like an institutional line to do social realism. And so for many years, Mexican literature, Mexican narrative was a narrative of social chronicles, of issues that were like really concrete. I understand too, we were building a revolutionary society based on a new collective imagination, and it was necessary. And it was like a place where the imagination apparently had few spaces. I think it was important that it still is really important.
Why is it so important? In your case, why are you driven to write this kind of literature?
me interesan estos temas porque
I'm interested in these issues for two reasons. First, because never in history have we been so linked in such a close way to technology. That is, through social networks and cell phones, we have a very intimate relationship with technology, and furthermore, we don't really understand very well. And on the other hand, it seems to me that fantasy literature, and specifically science fiction, serves as a kind of carnival mirror, a deformed mirror, where the people, reality is distorted, but it's still reality. And this mechanism, this metaphor of the fantastic, the imaginative, and the prospective interests me a lot.
Y ese mecanismo y esa metáfora de lo fantástico, de lo imaginativo, de lo prospectivo me interesa mucho.
You used to run a fanzine called Sub that was literally the subgenres of subterranean subliterature. Why so many subs in the case of science fiction?
No era electrónica, era impreso, era un fanzine que hacíamos, lo hacía con José Rangel y con Pepe Rojo. Ahora Pepe Rojo es escritor y José Rangel es el guitarrista.
It wasn't electronic, it was in print. It was a fanzine that we did with José Rangel and Pepe Rojo. Pepe Rojo is a writer. José Alfredo Rangel is the guitarist of Cate de Cuba. And he just published his second book of stories. And since then, we did it 20 years ago because back then, to do this kind of work, that is, we played a lot there with the irony of the subliterary. It encompassed all these drawers, like Kurt Vonnegut said, that some critics confused with the urinal. That is, science fiction, fantasy, and even criminal novels were very looked down upon by literary critics back then. So these forms of narrating and understanding the narrative world have moved to the center compared to 20 years ago to today, with a fair amount of success. But then they were subterranean. Sub or underestimated and undervalued. It was also very linked to the counterculture that there was at this moment on the post-punk scene in Mexico City. So yes, that's where the subterranean comes from. Also, Subcomandante Marcos was very much in fashion. So it was this whole play on the subterranean, the subliterary. There even used to be a term, I think it's a term that is no longer used, but they said subliterature to refer to all these things, that this has changed. I don't hear it anymore with the same frequency, but in fact, it's been a long time since I've heard it. But back then, the serious critics and academics and not a few writers referred to all this as subliterature. It was unthinkable, especially in the local context of Mexico City, for someone to show up with a paper on, for example, Tolkien or Stephen King in a forum because it was considered garbage. And now it has changed a lot.
Due to the relationship with the United States, no?
Yes, it's that our proximity to the United States has historically generated a tense love-hate relationship. There's no country that knows the Americans better than the Mexicans, and there's no country closer or farther away at the same time than Mexico. It's to say that the distance from Canada is much less. Canada can create more or less symmetrical relationships with the United States, but Mexicans can't do that. So this has always meant that from the cultural sphere, the United States is seen with has always meant that it's seen with a certain distrust from Mexico, in spite of having a very rich culture that I think has been valued much more in the last 20 years.
Siempre se ha dicho que se le ve con cierta desconfianza desde México, a pesar de tener una cultura muy rica, que creo que se ha valorado mucho más en los últimos 20 años.
I'd argue that one of the reasons that it's very hard for a foreign writer to be known in the United States is that it has a very rich, very complete, very vast and very diverse literary tradition, as in few other places, and that has been recognized in Mexico only quite recently. You used a very common expression to hear in the United States, there's no culture, which is just stupid.
Una descalificación muy común de decir en los Estados Unidos no hay cultura, lo cual es una estupidez.
So that's why, in part, you did the anthology of U.S. and Canadian science fiction writers, and you call it a bridge between the two cultures. Well, when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about the detective novels. We'll be right back after a short pause. We're back with the writer Beth, and before the pause, we were talking about your work in science fiction. And now I wanted to move to the police novels. Recently, a big part of your work has been in this genre, including Burning Ice and Season of Scorpions. Why the attraction for the police novel?
Mi llegada al género policíaco fue casi fortuita. O sea, yo había escrito una novela de ciencia ficción que se llama Gel Azul.
Into the genre of crime novels almost by accident. I had written a science fiction novel called Blue Gel that had been rejected by all the publishing houses. It was a different time in Mexico, so it had been rejected by all the publishers. I was an unknown. I was a writer just debuting. It was my first novel, and it was really hard. And so I was really desperate in terms of that had been rejected by at least 4 publishers. There I had heard about a contest for crime novels, a national contest. I thought it was a fairly easy crossover because the foundational author, who was Edgar Allan Poe, wrote crime novels, mysteries, horror, and science fiction. It's like he established the modern basis for all of these. Let's say the first one in the 19th century.
There are a lot of authors that are crossover between those genres, aren't there?
Yes, that's right. Ray Bradbury. He began writing noir and crime novels. He's a pair of crime novels. Ed McBain wrote science fiction novels, although he's known for his crime novels. So that's how I decided how I made this crossover. The first is Age of Scorpions, which in fact just came out in a new edition a little while ago. It's the story of a hitman who decides not to do his last job, and when he goes to give back the money he had received in advance, a group of young cartel leaders bursts into the bank where he's waiting. They kidnap him and they take him away. That's how the novel starts. It was quite successful. It succeeded in winning the contest, and then it was published, and it also came out in a pocket edition. It came out in Spain, and it was published in French too. So the crime novel opened a lot of doors for me that at the time science fiction couldn't open. I think it would be very different now, but at that time it couldn't open doors. And I discovered, well, I've always been an avid reader of both genres, but I discovered something very interesting. They combine well science fiction and crime novels. There are always touches of science fiction in my crime novels, but also it's a mirror that's even more immediate. The distortion of the carnival mirror isn't as extreme as it is in the mirror of science fiction.
Pero además es todavía un espejo como más inmediato, la distorsión del espejo de feria no es tan extrema como es en el espejo de la ciencia ficción.
Well, nowadays here in Mexico, especially the kind of novels that you're writing that have to do with drug trafficking and hitmen, it's too close to reality, no?
Bueno, en su momento Tiempo de Alacranes sucedía como en el futuro inmediato.
Well, in its time, the Age of Scorpions took place in the immediate future, and with all the incredibly inept counter-narcotics policies of Felipe Calderón, the president, really surpassed my immediate future. Yes, it has been. No, I've tried in my subsequent novels after Black Ice. I published one that's called White Collar to change it up a little. White Collar is about money laundering, and I'm writing the next that is the prequel is of Age of Scorpions. The first is Black Ice, and then comes White Collar, and I'm writing the third in the series that presumably is titled Circus Balto. That's about trafficking works of art, like moving into other branches of crime that seem interesting to me. Sure, we have like an immediate relationship with drug trafficking, but I think there are a lot of things you can talk about in crime novels from the perspective of this country.
Well, when we see the police novels, the detective novels, in the context of modern Mexico, they do almost cease to be fiction in some ways. And in fact, I was struck by the fact of the story that you wrote in 2005 and what happened in Coahuila, in Allende, Coahuila, 5 years later. I mean, there's so many similarities between those stories.
Yes, when you write science fiction, sometimes the scenarios can come true. Black Ice was a science fiction novel disguised as a crime novel because it all happened after the elections. And furthermore, the country became very violent. So this happened not because I was, well, nobody can tell the future, but the scenario was really likely. It was highly probable.
And I get the impression from many authors, including your work, that sometimes the purpose or part of the drive to write these kinds of stories is to serve as a sort of a warning to society, no?
Absolutamente. Sí,
Absolutely.
mira, siempre me gusta.
Look, I always like to cite what Héctor Echeverría said, a friend of mine who is also a writer.
Escritor también. Él decía que
He said that if England did not become a fascist dictatorship in the 50s, in large part, it was thanks to the fact that George Orwell had written 1984. And I think that's important. That's what this kind of work is really for, these kind of stories.
One of the other points that struck me of the latest police novels is that the protagonists, the good guys and the bad guys, are women. Why did you choose to use women's voices in these?
Porque me gustan las mujeres en el sentido de que yo
Because I like women in the sense that, well, I went to school with the Maris brothers from halfway through primary school to graduating from high school, and at that time these schools were all male. So the feminine during all my childhood, half my childhood, my adolescence and the early part of my youth was a mystery that I came to discover, to rediscover, when I got to college to study graphic design in the Ibero-American University, where 80% of the class was women. So it was a discovery, and now I'm the father of a girl. And it was, on the one hand, I was interested in the challenge of creating a voice that seemed authentically female, that it didn't sound like a transvestite, that it didn't seem like a man disguised as a woman. And on the other hand, because it seemed to me that it gave it a lot of strength to the story, the fact that they were women. In White Collar, the novel White Collar, I beg your pardon, Black Ice, won a literary prize, and I always attribute this triumph to the fact that they were female voices. I think...
Hielo Negro ganó un premio literario y yo siempre he atribuido este triunfo a que eran voces femeninas. O sea, si
do they bring another kind of sensibility, do you think, to the story?
Sí, por supuesto. Sí, o sea,
yes, of course. The fact that if it had been a policeman and a drug trafficker, it would have been a novel like so many others. There's a pile like that. The fact that it's from the point of view of two women, counterimposed and yet linked at the same time by an act of revenge, gives it a depth and a subtlety it wouldn't have had otherwise. It's not that they are less brutal or less violent, but it would not have had this if men had told the story. And this was like my big discovery for this series.
And isn't it difficult to get inside the head of a woman, even if it's a woman that you've invented?
A little while ago, Stephen Hawking said that the biggest mystery in the universe is a woman. So of course, yes, it's been an experience. I've ended up exhausted when I finished these two novels. It implies a huge creative effort to steal a female voice, and one of those things to manage to make it a coherent voice. So yes.
And a lot of research.
Yes, a lot of research. For me, it implies the part that interests me the most about a novel of science fiction or a crime novel is the research part, because you have to build a really solid structure to hang your story on and hold it up firmly.
Well, I want to come back to that point because I want to talk about all the research that went into your graphic novel on William Burroughs here in Mexico. So we'll come right back to that. Don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. We're back with Beth, the Mexican writer, and we're about to turn to the third genre, which is the graphic novel. Uncle Bill, the story of one of literature's most enigmatic and interesting characters, William Burroughs, here in Mexico. How did you decide to do this as a graphic novel?
William Burroughs
William Burroughs is from when I first discovered his work when I was very young, like I was telling you, and I had already been very tied into the countercultural scene and the post-punk scene that was going on here for a while, and from that moment Burroughs was very important. I discovered that he had started to use the term heavy metal in his novels. It was in music I really liked, heavy metal. So for me, discovering this and knowing that he had lived in Mexico City, well, This figure became an obsession for me. Around those years, more than 20 years ago, Jorge Garcia Robles published The Bala Perdida, The Stray Bullet, which is a biographical chronicle of Burroughs in Mexico. And I discovered that he is a magnificent metaphor of the relationship between the two countries. He's a brilliant American who arrives in Mexico, and really he isn't interested in Mexico. He was fleeing, and he could have been in any other place. He could have been in any other city. He could have been in Bogota.
He had legal problems in the United States that he had to escape.
Not only was it the closest place, he had a certain fascination with the pre-Hispanic, but none whatsoever for contemporary Mexico. He doesn't link up at all with the local artists or go to the museums. He arrives to lie this life of an expat, and furthermore, here he ends up committing this really stupid assassination of his wife that never is really cleared up, whether he assassinated her, or it was an accident, or whether he did it on purpose or not.
Well, speaking of images and the image of the relationship between the United States and Mexico, you chose to do this novel with images as a graphic novel. What are the advantages of this form?
There are places where the word alone is not enough to get the message across, and places where the image alone is not enough. They have very different ways of reaching people, but when they combined, they are more than the sum of their elements. They are more than 2, 1 plus 1, because they multiply the force. They don't add, they multiply. So the narrative potential of the image combined with words and sequences, like in comics, is gigantic. When an illustrated book works, it's as if the word and the image dance together. But in the comics and cartoons, when you combine them, they come together in a very tight way. It's as if they began to kiss. After having danced, they start to kiss passionately. And this complicity usually just happens in comics or in graphic novels.
When you say there are places where the written word doesn't arrive alone, or the image doesn't reach people, do you mean like sectors of the population, or what do you mean? What are the sectors that most look for the graphic novel, do you think?
No, I haven't talked so much about sections or types of readers, sectors or types of readers, although I think that youth has a special affinity for this format, for this medium. No, I'm referring to the fact that there are descriptions, atmospheres, moments in which the image is more powerful than the word, and there are others.
Of what you want to describe.
Depending on what you want to narrate, that is what you want to talk about, tell about. And there are moments when words are much more powerful than the image alone. They say that a word is, or that an image is worth 1,000 words, but I don't think so. There are also words that are worth more than 1,000 images. So what happens is if you have 1,000 and 1,000, what you'll have will be 10,000 approximately when it's multiplied. This is what I'm referring to, the potential as a tool of communication. It grows exponentially.
And have you seen this growing? There seems to be kind of a boom in the graphic novel recently in the United States and other countries. Do you think that that's going to happen, or is happening now in Mexico too?
I'd like to think that yes, and that furthermore it's a positive evolution. I've been drawing professionally for 25 years. When I'd been at it for 20 years, I published my first graphic novel, because in all the previous ones it was impossible. I published with Alfagarra, a novel called Espiral, and it turned out badly because at that time Alfagarra didn't know what to do with it. They wanted to promote it as a children's book, and there wasn't a place for graphic novels, and it faded away. 5 years later now, well, when Uncle Bill came out, there are spaces. These spaces have changed, and there's more acceptance and another way to... That is, it's very different. In the past 5 years, the publishing industry has evolved more than in the past 20 years before. So it seems to me that yes, it's a good moment. I think that now the challenge for local creators is to fill the stands with Mexican graphic novels. I'm still waiting for the moment when the large publishing houses that have presence in Mexico, the 3 or 4 large publishers, begin to publish graphic novels by Mexican authors. I think it's a good moment that we've been waiting for. It's like a surfer who waits for the wave, the big wave. So as a group, the graphic novelists, we have to hop on and ride this wave onto the beach.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing all this new work coming out. Beth, thanks so much for joining us here on Interviews from Mexico. And thank you. I'm Laura Carlsen. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.